Education is a near universal experience, touching most of us as pupils, parents, or simply as members of society. It not only shapes individual futures, but it also shapes the kind of society we become. For more than a century, many modern education systems have rested upon a familiar bargain: acquire knowledge, gain credentials, move into work, and participate in society. But it was never a perfect bargain, and it never worked equally for everyone. But it established a broadly understood pathway. Educational achievement led to work, work led to opportunity, and opportunity led to social progress. That bargain is now being tested. Work is becoming less predictable. Technology is changing how knowledge is created, accessed, and applied, and in doing so, transforming our societies. The OECD has stated the challenge clearly. Education is now trying to prepare people for jobs that do not yet exist, technologies that have not yet been invented, and social challenges we cannot yet fully imagine. The challenge, then, is not simply to keep refining the model we inherited, but to ask whether the underlying assumptions our education systems are built upon still hold true.
Welcome to the 13th episode of Behind the Algorithm, where we're joined by education expert Carla Aerts, asking the question, does the fourth industrial revolution create the opportunity to completely rethink what education actually is and how it works for us? Our conversation with Carla is going to frame how education got to where it is today, paint a picture for a better future, and then discuss how we go about achieving it. Carla, a very warm welcome. And before we get into the heart of the discussion, would you mind giving our audience a brief introduction and sharing how your passion for education developed?
Thank you, Greig, and wonderful to be here. So yeah, I'm Carla. I kind of fell into education somewhat by accident, and I'm not ashamed of that at all. I started my career in the performing arts and then pivoted into kind of digital media. And at one point, I was asked to kind of lead or manage a program on the transformation for a publisher from textbook to what we call blended learning. So a mix of textbook and digital learning. And this was across a number of European markets. And that's where I got really hooked on it, because I always said, I'm not going to work in technology in education because education doesn't move. But the minute I saw how complex it was and how messy it was and how all these different regions and markets have their different kind of context, I got completely hooked on the thing. I thought it was like, wow, this is so messy. It's wonderful. And so this was just in Europe. And then I went to Cambridge and became global digital director for schools at Cambridge University Press at that time. And there I kind of was able to go to Australia, to Africa, to all sorts of places beyond Europe as well. I'd done a lot of work outside of Europe before I got into education. And then that enriched only my experience. I always got very cross with how we approached it and with how publishers approached it, because they kind of were so hooked on their textbook model that they sort of felt they had to kind of stick to it and replicate it, which is actually not really good for digital principles. But nevertheless, that's what we did. And I then also started working with a lot of startups at the time. And so I got into the EdTech scene. Doing quite a lot of startup mentoring, working with startups. I think I've worked with about 120, 150 across the world, from very light touch to kind of more intense mentoring. That also brings another perspective, because these guys and girls are much more grassroots. And they very often want to change education because they feel it's not doing the job. They're not always going about it very well because they don't really know enough about how learning works. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting ecosystem of activity. Then I became Director of Futures at the Institute of Education at the UCL, where I also started a kind of research and evidence-based incubator with Professor Rose Luckin, where we worked with 160 startups, I think, on sort of how can you as a startup evidence that what you do works, which is a good thing. So I left the institute and was offered to set up a kind of think tank initiative with a foundation, and did that and managed a big EdTech prize and brought together all sorts of people for mini events, looking at personalization, where's the future of education lie, what does technology do to learning, those kind of things, and also curated an event for politicians and policymakers where former heads of states and ministers of education would come together to come up with recommendations for their successors. So I did all sorts of things there. And then guess what? COVID happened. And for so many of us, COVID put a lid on so many things. And we all had to reinvent ourselves, and, some things didn't work anymore. And so unfortunately, the kind of think tank was disbanded because it wasn't really feasible to keep it going. And so I did some ad hoc projects during COVID, one of which was working with a kind of institute of Google in Paris, which was working with a number of NGO foundations across Europe, but in resource poor contexts. So we were looking at, can we do anything in these resource poor contexts and refugee camps to bring at least some education
Wow.
into, yeah. I have to admit, that was sobering. It was amazing, sobering, but actually, in so many cases, there was nothing much we could do. There would be one mobile phone in a camp where there was no electricity, that kind of thing. So what do you do? So did that for a bit during COVID, worked with some of these organizations. And then after COVID, helped a publisher out with their platforms and looking at sort of their digital change and transformation. Now, for the past 3 years, I think, or so, because I've always sort of oscillated between an independent agent and then I go and do some independent work somewhere and they ask me to stay. But now I have been an independent agent for the past 3 years or so, and I really like it. Yeah. So I work with universities, I work with startups, I work with accelerators, I do my own thing. So it's a real big mix of work. I've just finished a project with Cambridge and UNICEF and GPE on digital transformation in education for policymakers. Earlier in the year, I was working with educators in Kuwait, also with Cambridge, on sort of how to embed or introduce AI in their practice in a meaningful, sensible, ethical way. So as you can see, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Wow, that is incredible. Where to start? I think all of your work with startups is fascinating because I think, what did you say? So we're at UCL on Tuesday, actually. So you were working with 120 to 150 startups, and you were at UCL with 160 startups. And it kind of begs the question, why do all these startups want to kind of augment the current education system? Is that because it's broken? Is Western education systems, are they broken? And is that sort of because it's just not fit for purpose? It was based on a kind of a standardized and scalability model, and now it needs to be something more customized, more personalized.
There's a lot in your question, so I'll try and be somewhat succinct. Yes, there are definitely facets of the education system that are broken, but and it's not just the Western education system, but because we have to bear in mind that the Western education system is ruling the world and is everywhere, right? So to some extent, education has always been sort of somewhat colonial. You go to African countries and they have kind of French or English education system. So, which, obviously might be a bit more localized, but that's their route. So there is a commonality in these education systems worldwide. Now, I would say, yes, they are broken, but maybe not entirely. We also have to kind of recognize that there are very good things happening in education. But what really the problem is the kind of, is it still fit for purpose now? Because if we look at education and where it came from, and we often talk about the Prussian model, which is, these old photos. And actually, I went to school a little bit like that, where we all sit in rows on little, behind the school desk. And we have to be very quiet and we have to listen to the teacher all day long. Please don't ask any difficult questions because most teachers didn't like that very much. So if you asked a difficult question, you were not very welcome in the classroom. Whereas at least that bit has changed. You can actually, in most education systems, now ask questions, which is, of course, a skill that we need to nurture even more, given the way we are living and moving into this AI world. So that's definitely part of, the history of education, because it had to fulfill a purpose for its time and its society. We needed good, obedient workers to go to the workplace, either to the office, to the factory, and fulfill a particular thing based on a particular set of skills and knowledge. What's happened over the years is that the skills side, and I don't really like to call them skills, but let's call them skills because everybody does, which we kind of refer to as metacognition, critical thinking, all these kind of things, haven't really necessarily been addressed very well in most schools.
Yeah.
And because, the curriculum is the kind of the driver, and the curricula has become the driver in function of the assessment and the exams. And that is where it's broken, because we kind of measure kids on what they do in an exam or a high stakes test, not on what their potential is. And if we look now at what the world needs going forward in the future, yes, of course, you need to know a lot of things, because if you don't know a lot of things, you can't apply them and you can't kind of make connections and you can't kind of think outside of the box because you haven't got a reference point to kind of think about. So I'm not saying we have to ditch all knowledge, far from it. I'm even advocating that if kids want to learn Latin and Greek, let them. If kids in India want to learn Sanskrit, absolutely let them, because they're very, very useful things and they are our roots. So don't ditch the roots in education. But what's happening is that, we kind of so fixated on, you have to pass your exam. You have to pass your exam. You have to do well. You need an A star to go to university. So there's also that thing about, school is also a mechanism to go to university. We very seldom talk about vocational education. We very seldom, it's still sort of like second rate in the mind of a lot of people. Whereas, my goodness, if you can do something and come up with an idea that you can execute, making it with machines, with your hands, with all sorts of things, what a skill to have. And, that we kind of disregard that. And some of those skills won't be automated, by the way. So we shouldn't really ditch it. So that's sort of where it kind of in my book has gone wrong, that it got so curriculum-led in function of exams-led. And of course, that's also the kind of mentality we now instill in kids, because you have to do well for your exams. Because if you don't do well for your exams, you're not going to be able to go to university or get a good job. And we'll come to that, I'm sure, later. And that is a problem. So then, obviously, that becomes the driver for the whole system, rather than who are these wonderful people called youngsters who have a future, who need to thrive in life, who need, to carve their own way. And we kind of stifle all that. And that for me is where things are kind of broken. And that's what I think we need to definitely rethink, looking at what's good, because there's lots of good things. Stop determining that kids are going to have a C in their GCSE because they've done certain things, or stop determining that, they're not going to do very well on this, because actually we should take into account that kids might not have paid attention. Don't mean they can't do it. And that's where I think the thing goes wrong. So I'll stop there, because otherwise the cows will come home. Yeah.
Well, before we jumped on the call, we were having a conversation about an event that you ran this week, and you were talking about the Brookings report and the 4 states of learners. So out of those 4 states of learners, if you wouldn't mind explaining what they are for our audience, because we had a great conversation before we jumped on the call, and then maybe inform us, who has education served well out of those 4 states of learners and who has it failed?
Okay, so this conversation was based on a book called The Disengaged Team. There's also a Brookings report on AI in education, and we might come to that a little bit later. But I'll keep you to the Disengaged Team, which is focused on a piece of research that both authors, Jenny Anderson a journalist who also works for the New York Times, and is a fantastic author. And then Rebecca Brookings, who is the director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution in Washington. They undertook a kind of year-long or so research project across the whole of the United States, talking to kids, to parents, to researchers, to, sort of teachers around, what's happening with teens at schools. We see so much absence, we see so much disengagement. And they decided to write this wonderful book, which sort of also, it's not just highlighting the problem, but it's also giving tools of what we can do about the problem. But as they kind of navigated their research, they have identified that there are kind of types of learner. You shouldn't see type as something that's a label that's stuck on them at all. It's basically to do with states. And they can oscillate between the states, but typically you have your kind of passenger mode. So the passenger mode of learning is, I just sit at school, I cruise along, I'll just don't care very much necessarily, but I'll kind of get by and I just, do my thing. And I tend to pass my exams and I just keep quiet and carry on kind of thing. You have the resistor mode, which is a very interesting one, where kids actually resist because they, for a variety of reasons, often belong, emotion, all those kind of things are very important in how kids fare in education. So for one or other reason, they sort of feel like, I don't really want to do this. I'm not interested. They're not necessarily very rebellious in the classroom, but they just, or they might not turn up, or they just resist it. And then you've got the kind of achievers, and obviously these people are very competitive. They really want to do well in their exams, but they're focused on. They often are also quite good at sports and very competitive in sports, and they really want to achieve and do well. But often they might do well in their exams, but actually they don't necessarily do that well on kind of mental health and all those sort of attributes that gives them the sort of resilience that they need to thrive in life. Because the book also talks about, well-being and how to thrive in life going forward. And then the final one, which is the mode or the state that actually works best, is the explorer mode. And that is where learners go, oh, I'm going to discover what this is all about. Okay, teachers mentioned something. I need to know more about it. After spoken to my dad, who, is quite interested in this, and he said something interesting, I'm going to find out what that is. And they just go and find out. And they might do that with their peers. They might do it on their own. They often talk to their parents, and they're very curious about finding out more. And it's these learners, the kind of discoverers or the explorers, that actually tend to fare best. It's also this type of learner or state of learning that we believe will do much better in the future of education, because they go and find out. And of course, if you look at what the workforce needs now, it's not just about doing what you're being told, but also have the aptitude to go and find out. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Sure, Jenny and Rebecca would say, well, Carla, you sold us a little bit short, but, we could talk about this book for hours, and hopefully you'll get an opportunity to do that with them sometime. That's kind of basically what it comes to. And then in the book, there are lots of kind of tips and tools for parents. The book is aimed at parents initially, but it doesn't take much to kind of extrapolate that to the classroom or to teachers and school settings.
I was just going to follow up on that because so one of Greg's points was, where do you think, so does that, if we apply that to say the UK education system and the
Yeah.
curriculum we've got today, where does our education system focus now against those sort of passenger, resistor, achievers and explorer type categories?
Well, that's really good. Yeah, that's a really good question, because it also depends a little bit where you are. In
Okay.
the UK, we have this kind of disparity between the sort of state sector. And I really do not want to belittle the state sector, because I have huge admiration for what happens in there. I'm a trustee of a small mat. What I see happen in that mat difficult conditions is amazing. So, but they're also more kind of bound to follow the rules and to what the DFE tells them to do. So they might have less leeway. Um, doesn't mean they don't do it well. In some schools, they are doing amazing things with the kids. They're letting them be explorers when it suits.
Yeah.
And it's also not necessarily the school letting them be. It's also the kind of inner aptitude of or kind of mentality that the kid develops to be it. Even in a strict system, in some of these schools in the States, it's quite strict. So these kids still have the kind of interest to go and explore. So you can do that in any system if you want. It just, and it will benefit whoever.
Yes.
It's not a question necessarily, is the system set up for it? The question is the system actually encouraging it? And that's probably more the point, and that will happen more in some schools than others, whether they're in state or independent. And if you look at the independent schools, quite often they've got so many more facilities, they've got, makers labs, they've got all sorts of things. They can do more things that might nurture those kind of states, especially the explorer state more. So that I think it's the way the education system works in the UK, where you have maybe more privilege in certain schools than others. And if you're a school in a resource poor context in the UK, where demographics are, not as affluent or not as haven't got the same opportunities, then things become much harder. Also, teaching in those schools where there are lots of other problems also becomes much harder. So it's not really a question of black and white. It's a nuance. It's a spectrum, I think.
It is, and it's very tough because, I mean, let's face it, most of the world lives in a grey area. It's not always a cut and dry black and white, as you rightly point out.
Mm.
I must admit, as you were
Yeah.
saying that, though, one of the things I was trying, when you first explored that topic, one of the things I was going through my mind is trying to work out where I was when I was at school. Whether was I an explorer? Was I a resistor? Was I a passenger?
The thing is, Nigel, we're not always, even the most explorers, they're not always explorers, and they can't be. There will be times when they're just going, yeah, I'm going to be, and they're not. Obviously, it's not a conscious act necessarily. That they'll just be cruising in passenger mode, because
Yeah.
also, brain may need that. We may need to kind of sort of step back a little bit. So it's not like you're in one kind of box and you stay in that box. No, there's you kind of move through different, and, typical. Quite a lot of kids hate maths, not because they can't do it, but because it seems so irrelevant or so strange to them that they don't engage with it. So they might go in resistor mode, or they might go in passenger mode and really not care very much. They might really love history, and guess what? They go into explorer mode. So it's not sort of, you're not one thing or another. You can be, going through different kind of modes if you like.
I don't think I was on that. I don't think I was on any of those lists. I think I was the rebellious one, the fifth one. There were definitely subjects that I enjoyed, like art and drama and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But the more traditional, formulaic, structured education just didn't appeal to me at all. Education's come up a lot in the news recently. I can't remember who I was listening to, but they said things like philosophy and critical thinking have been bled out of sort of traditional education. Do you think that we need to be bringing stuff like that back in again as the rise of AI kind of gives access to all information and makes everything available and at our fingertips? Do we need to have more structured ways of thinking, like metacognition, self-regulation, critical thinking, that kind of stuff?
100%. I mean, we definitely need it. And to your philosophy question, I would say it's critical that we bring philosophy into the curriculum. Apart from anything else, if you look at how we have to kind of interact with generative AI, even, if you talk about machine learning, per se, how to use that. You don't do that because you know a lot of things. Obviously, you know a lot of things, but especially with generative AI, master the art of asking the question. If you don't ask the question well, you're not going to get very much out of this thing, except for, very superficial stuff. And the whole point is that you kind of learn how to ask deeper questions and how to challenge things and how to kind of reflect on it. And I think that's really critical here. That, sorry, we have the, to make sure kids have the knowledge, but that they also are equipped to ask the question. So currently in assessment, you're asked to answer the question all the time. Maybe we need to move to structures where we also look at how kids ask questions. And philosophy and reasoning is obviously a very good thing to do that. So I'm just going to have a quick drink.
I'm personally all pro the philosophy piece, not just because I think it's about asking the right questions, but I think also it's about, and so in that narrow lane of asking the right question, but it's also about asking the right question about, should I be doing this? Is this the right thing to do to start with? And actually
Yeah,
helping with those moral compasses and developing those moral compasses
yeah.
that all of us need, be it as a leader, be it as a business leader, whatever role we're playing in life, we all need that. And philosophy is a huge part of that. I just wanted to come back to one of the points you raised earlier. One of the things you were talking about was around the education, and you talked about some of the differences around the world. What I'd love to be fascinated is sort of get from your perspective. We talked about maybe some where things are going wrong, but also which countries around the world are doing education maybe right, or where could we learn from?
Oh, gosh, that's really quite a hard question, because is it at country level? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Obviously, we get the OECD reports, right? And they kind of have the PISA, so the assessment tests and statistics on how kids are doing, or how teachers are doing in particular countries. These countries tend to be typically rich and affluent countries, and first world countries, if you like. So already that gives a bit of a distorted view on things. Estonia stands out. Singapore stands out. All these countries are doing very well, and are providing very good education. Finland is interesting because their model of education is very different. The way they look at the teacher profession is very different. So in order to be a teacher in Finland, you actually have to have I believe it's a master's degree now, and you're being paid as much as a doctor. So teachers in Finland are doing very well in terms of, sort of professional opportunity. The education and the sort of models they use in Finland are very different to, for instance, the British education system. You also find kids learning outside in below, -20. Because they have to play, they have to go outside, they have to do things, they have to do all these wonderful things. So it's a very different system. They also not as hooked on the rigidity of the assessment system that you find in other places. Estonia is also very interesting because, of course, it was a former Soviet state, if you like, and they've kind of shut that husk or cocoon completely, and they had an opportunity to reinvent their education system. Small country, so they can. There's a huge amount of, and you probably know this better than I do. The amount of innovation that's going on in Estonia is quite staggering. So they're doing very well now, and they also really thriving in their education system. Singapore in a very different model. Equally doing extremely well, and are sort of being regarded as sort of flagship education systems. The thing is, though, what's dangerous is that countries then start looking at, oh, Singapore is doing really great at maths, so let's have Singapore maths in our country. Now that might not work, because Singapore has a very discrete context. Estonia has a discrete context. Finland has a discrete context. And so it's not about supplanting that context into your own context, because that's where things often fall apart. And that's where we have to be careful, because there's two things about education that I cannot stress enough. It's contextual, and has to be, because it's part of your own culture, of your nation's identity, so it's very contextual. And also it is actually, for good learning, it has to keep a social fabric. And the social fabric of education is really, really important. And that's where we have to be very careful with technology, that we don't break that social fabric. And actually, in a lot of systems, that's not enhanced enough, because they might, like for instance, in Africa, because of the number of kids they might have in a classroom, because of the lack of good teacher development and teacher education in a number of countries, or teachers being totally isolated, also in other countries like India, in the middle of rural villages, without any peers. They can only do what they can do. And they might have classrooms with about 60 kids in them, of different ages and stages. So what do you do? So you're going to have your kids sitting on benches in front of you, because, how do you manage that classroom? And, you use instructional models that are now quite outdated. But, that's how it happens. I'm not saying that that's right. That context isn't right, but that's what they've got. So, and it's not always very successful. So that's also where we need to start looking at, what can we do to support those kind of contexts better as rich nations, not by handouts, but by, helping these people develop their teacher education, develop how they can maybe use technology and those kind of things to help them achieve better learning experiences. Yeah.
That's a great point. So where is technology kind of coming in and helping with things like disparate learning, with supporting the contextual nature of education within a country? I don't know if those two are aligned.
I don't think they are, Greg, because I tell you why. And this is a discussion I often have with startups. And I don't envy these people, right? Because being an EdTech startup, I think there's no harder startup than being an EdTech startup. Partly because of all the stuff that I've
Really?
just talked to you. Yeah, because of all the stuff that I've just talked to you about. What does an investor want? First question they're going to ask is, how are you going to scale this? And of course, if you're going to scale this, then you might have that tension with context and with localization and with, so it's not always scalable. It's not because we teach math in the UK that teaching math in Ethiopia is the same thing. Yet, if you wanted to take your solution to Ethiopia for maths, you might need to scale it to take it to Ethiopia. They have to probably do quite a lot of work to make it work in Ethiopia. Hence, that scaling argument goes somewhat to pot. So there are these kind of frictions, if you like, between the scaling need that you need as a startup and as a scale up to succeed. And in some domains, that will, English language learning is a global phenomenon, so that might work. However, if you want to do English language learning for primary school, then you might have to kind of revise what you do. And if you want to take English language learning to the Middle East, you need to kind of be cognizant of being that you need to kind of have the cultural references that apply to them. So it's not just a thing like, oh, we've got this wonderful technology, let's just roll it out everywhere. And that's where it's hard for EdTech startups, because that makes it really quite tricky in terms of return on investment and in terms of investor satisfaction or investor needs. So that's a bit of a problem. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's quite hard to do. And I think one of the biggest problems with EdTech for me still is that we're trying to retrofit the technology in what's happening in schools today. I'm not blaming any of these startups that they're doing this. I'm just saying it's not the right way to do this. What is good technology? It's technology that transforms. That's technology that's successful. That's technology that, kind of flies because it's got a transformational effect. If you look at, sort of how technologies have improved medicine and how that works and how they're using AI, and it's transformative. In education, the technology hasn't really been that transformative.
It's
And I
it's
think
perpetuating it's perpetuating institutional norms.
exactly. And you can't blame the startups for that at all, because they're also expected to work within a framework. And if they want to have a business model that works, they have to work within that framework. But it does lose that whole potential of being really transformative. And I'm not saying that it needs to change everything, but the way we kind of use the technology in schools is often very, very counterintuitive, not transformational, sort of re-emphasizes the kind of current state of affairs. And that, I think, is a lost opportunity of what we do with technology. I think AI may change that, but obviously there are huge questions, huge concerns, huge should we do it, should we not do it? And if we do it, how do we do it? But actually, I think AI could be quite a catalyst for that. If we look at all the ifs that are associated with it and the difficulty of introducing it in education settings.
I was going to on that, because that's a nice, lovely segue. So thank you for that. You've delivered perfectly. But because one of the things you talked about there about, what are some of the challenges, some of the issues, scaling versus friction, localization versus context, which is actually, to be fair, a lot of startups face. And when I talk to startups outside of the education sector, a lot of the time you are saying to them, you need to look at how you localize your product and your delivery and your experience for that local market, even if the back end infrastructure may be similar. But anyway, you talked about some of the challenges there. So if we were sort of saying, okay, let's design education from a blank piece of paper, first principles, what would you put at the center of that if we were to say, right, here's a blank sheet of paper, let's go for it, let's change things? What would be those principles you'd put at the center?
It's about localizing domains. 100% agree with you. I think in education it's just more extreme and it's harder. That's the difference. And so therefore you need to kind of work with local curricula. You need to kind of work with local culture. So I'm not dismissing it in other domains at all. So please don't get me wrong on that. So if I got the blank slate, I think the thing we need to do is we need to look at ourselves and say, what is education for now? And why? And then who is it for? I think we often forget that education is actually for the learners, because we often, quite rightly, focus on teachers, and we should focus on teachers. You will never hear me say, don't focus on teachers. You'll never hear me say, oh, AI can do a teacher's job. Absolutely not, 100%. Teachers are instrumental. But the way that relationship between teacher and learner is going to have to change and actually students were also talking about that the other day, is that teachers become much more of a kind of mentor and a co-learner. So the relationship becomes, rather than I'm the teacher, I'm telling you, I'm disseminating the knowledge, I'm kind of explaining concepts to you, and then we kind of try and work through that together. There's a shift in that relationship between teacher and learner, and that's not just me saying it. That's most people acknowledging that relationship needs to change in terms of how education needs to change. One thing education is very focused on is safeguarding. Now, we need to safeguard, I'm not saying, but with that, we've also lost the kind of side of caring. And I don't mean sort of caring in a subservient way. I mean caring in terms of nurturing way, in terms of developing kids, let them be explorers, for instance. And when you're an explorer and you fall down, you might hurt your knee, but you get up and you try, you put a plaster on it and you try again, kind of thing, but with the help of your teacher. But having that sort of environment in which you can actually have that nurturing, that caring, that also getting kids to understand that nothing is ever certain. Let them be vulnerable. Let them not always be, and also teachers. There's a fantastic book by a professor in California called Alison Gopnik, called The Gardener and the Carpenter. And people who've heard me talk before will go like, oh no, there she is again with that. It's one of my favorite. a professor on specialist in early years. And you mentioned early years before. I'm a great believer that's where it all starts. And what she wrote in that book, she kind of looks at the analogy of the gardener and the carpenter. Obviously, the carpenter works with a template and kind of everything is measured. And if it's not measured rightly, it's not going to work, right? She then looks at the gardener and says, the gardener doesn't, they might know what seeds they're kind of propagating, but they don't know what's going to come out and how that garden will look, even if it's been carefully designed. And that's sort of what the book is for parents. But again, I kind of tend to extrapolate that to the classroom. That's what we also need to kind of instill in the classroom. It's part of that blank slate. Let's kind of introduce that sort of nurturing and the fact, our world is becoming increasingly uncertain. It's always been uncertain, but, there's so many drivers now that makes it definitely feel more uncertain. So to deal with that uncertainty, we also need that kind of caring and nurturing ability being introduced into education. So that for me is very, very central. We still need to work out how we kind of disseminate knowledge, what knowledge that is. For instance, we talked about philosophy, we talked about, subjects being kind of eroded because they don't sort of necessarily fit what the workforce might demand of people, and they might not be immediately applied directly. So it's not because something can't be applied directly and it's not an engineering discipline or a science discipline that we don't need it. So I definitely would advocate that we bring humanities much more into this, and that we also look at it in a more interdisciplinary way. So, you kind of, you might be doing a maths project, but within that maths project, you might actually bring in a painting and you might bring in, all sorts of other things that actually connect things, because everything is so interconnected now, and we don't tend to interconnect in the curriculum very much. In some schools they do, and I'm not saying, but the curriculum as such in doesn't really do that, and it's or do that to a stage now that can help growing for the future. So those are kind of things that I would change, and I also very do a lot of kind of research in the science of learning, so how our mind works and how our brain works and how we learn. And I think that needs to come into this as well. So in teacher education, we should definitely introduce a level of understanding of how the brain works and how we learn. And actually, we should do the same with kids. We never talk to kids about, how you learn. How does your brain work? And it's that if you do talk to kids about that, their ears prick up and they go like, oh, wow, yeah, I get it now. So, and they get really quite enthused by this. So, so we need more space for that kind of sort of how we learn, understanding learning, how it works, getting kids engaged in that. And then if you look at young children, early years again, sorry, here I go again. What do? They constantly ask questions. They constantly go and explore. They go and find out. They introduce that kind of mindset more into the rest of education. Don't knock it out. That's one of the biggest problems with institutional education, is that the minute the kids go to sort of proper school, leave those kind of play environments and kindergarten, that gets so knocked out of them. They have to draw straight lines. It's like, oh, yeah, you need to draw a house with a straight line. But I want a house with a curved line. And, that kind of stuff. And letting kids explore their own sort of imagination as well in how learning works, I think is really important. Some people will find that outlandish. I think it's essential to get kids to thrive and to prepare them for a thriving future where they can also connect to other disciplines, other even things that don't interest them, to kind of solve them together with other people and communicate about.
I'm with you. I'm there. I mean, I'm on the education journey, having been through it myself, and now going through it with my children. All of those things, I think sometimes let our children not obviously I don't want to see them hurt or injured in any way, but let them make mistakes, let them fall over, as you rightly say, let them climb the tree and work out where they can get to the limits of climbing their tree and discover those things.
Yeah,
Those things are all brilliant because it gives them confidence as well. And it gives
exactly,
them the confidence
exactly.
to experiment, the confidence to try, the confidence to fail. And
Yeah,
that's if we give people the confidence to fail, they know they can get up, carry on, and it doesn't actually mean anything rather than the fear of failure. If we give them the confidence to fail, then actually they will experiment and they will grow and they'll learn. And actually, as a society, I think, and this is a bit of a personal belief, I think as a society, we will grow both economically
yeah.
and also in terms of the state and our mental state. Sorry, anyway, Greg,
No, no,
I
I've got
totally with you. Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
no, 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 not at all. No, I want to actually ask a question to Nigel because he has kids that are currently going through the education system, varying ages, and I just wanted to hear sort of firsthand from you, Nigel, how your kids are being nurtured in school, where things like emotional intelligence and creativity are so important to the future of kids' education outside of the hierarchical subjects like maths and English. How are they being given sort of a broad spectrum of humanities to study rather than just those maths and English?
So I think it's a tricky, it's a tricky question to answer. And the reason why I say that is because as Carla's sort of alluded to, within the education quality system, there's a curriculum which they need to follow. And there's
Yeah.
certain attainments and measures, because quite often sometimes education feels like a grading system for a small person.
Yes.
And in that grading system, the school may want to go down this path of being a little more nurturing and giving them a wider education, but they know they've also got to fit them through this narrow gap or try and get them through this narrow gap of attainment of grades so they can move on and progress through the education system. So I think it's a tricky balance, I'd say. And what I'd say is a mixed bag at the moment. So I'm fortunate with my children, and I'm also very fortunate that my wife is also not only a teacher, she's also studied at master's level educational psychology. So and she continues her sort of personal development along that path as well. So she spends a lot of time investing in growing her knowledge and experience around that. And so she brings a lot of that into our home. And so we're fortunate in the sense that we have that. But our children do, when I see them being nurtured in ways, be that quite often on the sports field. So, because I have also have a mix of girls and boys, and I see that sometimes different activities suit different children, and they gain and grow from different things, be it a physical movement activity, or some of them times sitting in a classroom and participating in something else. So, I think it really what I see is if the kids are just sat in a classroom, it's not going to suit everybody. It's going to suit a certain subsect who are either really skilled at that or they may just be adapting to that environment and performing in that environment. So I think it's a very tricky one. But what I do love is one of the things when we go and look at schools and my wife and I are talking about these things, we ask questions like, what are the activities outside of the classroom that the children get to do? So what is their break time activities? Are they given a ball and stumps and sports equipment? Are they given access to art rooms where they can just go and be messy and creative and just not structured, but just given some paper and some paints or clay or whatever it may be, and just let their imaginations flow and develop. And so we're very fortunate that our children do get access to that. And I know that's a very privileged position to be in compared to many. So does that answer your question, Greg?
Yeah, it does. And I was going to throw this back to Carla and say that as we're seeing sort of technology be more integrated into the education system, how does it allow for that kind of learning? How can it facilitate and uh, create more opportunities for kids across the country to a certain degree scale, but scale within our own ecosystem, the ability for that level of personalization for each kid that they get the kind of learning structure that suits them, kind of based around what Nigel said with his kids.
It's a really big question, and it's a very important question. Um,
Whoops.
and I think one thing we haven't spoken about yet is kind of our Milburn report and the needs, right? So who are not in education, not in training, not in employment. And how do we get that segment of the population to re-engage with learning so they can get the skills to kind of thrive in the world and to find a job and to take part in society as not isolated members in society, but fully embedded members of society. So that I think technology can help there. But also we need to rethink that whole kind of problem and how we address that. So I don't think we can focus too much on that in this podcast because that's a podcast in its own right. But I just wanted to highlight we shouldn't lose sight of it because it's a big problem. It's an economic problem. It's first and foremost a really mental health and esteem problem for those kids. So that's really quite tricky. Then in terms of how do we do this personalized learning? How do we make sure that every kid can thrive? Can technology help? Yes, it certainly can, but not if we just focus it on how they need to pass the test, which is how we tend to do it still. And that's an opportunity lost because actually what you're doing is you're just making the tunnel to the test even narrower in a way. You might be personalizing it, but it's still focused on that little light at the end that passing your test or doing very well on your test. That I think is not a good use of personalization, but it tends to be the use of personalization that is, I suppose, most widespread. If you then look at opportunities that personalization can bring, how can we kind of encourage a kid? How can we let them explore how learning works, for instance? I don't see much evidence of that in EdTech yet. I think people are thinking about it. There's definitely more focus on sort of mental health and well-being in EdTech, which is a good thing, and things are definitely shifting. But those are the kind of things about how can technology support that, and they're sort of encouraging people to kind of go and explore things as well. So that's one thing. And I'm not necessarily talking about generative AI here. I'm probably talking much more about, traditional machine learning, not necessarily rule-based, but probably with some supervised algorithms behind it. Then, but, it could take on different guises as long as it's safe for kids to use. When it comes to generative AI, and of course, that is where the big debate is raging and where people also get confused because everybody thinks that AI is now ChatGPT. And even if you talk to schools, they tend to use GPT as, we're using AI, so we use ChatGPT. And you kind of go like, okay, are you all using ChatGPT? So you're all kind of funneling it into this one tool. That's not necessarily a good idea. But it's what teachers kind of use first, and the sort of the name has become it has become Gen AI. So that's where I think there are lots of opportunities. I'm not saying, using the big language models. I think we need to kind of scaffold these models so that we have bespoke models for safe use within those environments, but actually models that let you explore and that one thing I talk a lot about when I talk to schools or do, little talks is like we need to kind of have the mentality of the sandbox in the school. So that is like an experimentation space, safe experimentation space in the school where teachers and the learners co-create and co-learn together. So you might have a bit like Google does, they give their developers time to come up with new ideas. Have time in the school, and obviously that needs discussion with curriculum authorities and all that kind of stuff. But make time in your school that once a week or once every fortnight, you explore with the kids for 2 hours using these tools and discover what these tools do. Don't just get the tool imposed to you and just kind of try and find out for yourself. Now, there are a lot of good initiatives happening on helping teachers use Gen AI and in their development. So I'm not dismissing those by any means, but I think the need for exploration and experimentation at small scale in, with the right models in a safe environment, running them locally so that, data protection and all this stuff, because that's a hornet's nest, can be safeguarded. That for me is what we should be looking at. And how do we do that? And how can a startup, multiple startups help us do that effectively? I think if that is a big nut to crack, but if we crack that carefully, even in the very unlikely scenario that, the AI bubble may burst, it's still going to be with us. They still need to be able to use it. They still need to kind of develop that skill set. So it's not lost. It will ask, I mean, it's foundation of lots of other skill sets. So it's not a question of AI. It's actually what do we do and how do we experiment? And yes, we happen to use Gen AI. But it's a fantastic opportunity to do that and also then get the kids and the teachers familiar with what the technology can do, how they should think about it. And that, I think, if we can crack that nut and also do that with needs in kind of safe environments that are targeted for them and to them, I think we've got something that is potentially quite powerful. And that's not about, oh, you have written your essay with AI, you have cheated. No, it's like, let's experiment with this together as teachers and learners, or as lecturers and learners. Obviously, university settings are a bit different, very different, but, we need that experimentation space. Very interesting. I was doing a talk with Andrea Schleicher from the OECD, who heads up the education division there. And he even mentioned, like, unless we start having room for experimentation, this ain't going to work. So he was advocating we need that kind of safe experimentation. So I think for me, that is kind of critical. And I think it's an opportunity that if we don't use it, we'll miss a lot. And we'll actually also miss the opportunity for kids to get themselves familiar with these technologies in a safe and a constructive way.
I mean, that is, I love the experimentation together. I was going to ask you earlier, sort of, if we had a blank sheet of paper, then what would, next thing was going to be, then what would your Tuesday morning look like for a teacher and in the classroom? I now assume that your Tuesday morning, if you were sort of telling us the future of education, it would be about experimentation.
Yes, and I mean, it would be, very scaffolded. So the teacher would still have to come up with, a scaffolded setting to,
Yeah.
so don't necessarily advocate like do anything you like, but because also that kids often find that quite difficult. Some kids can do that very well, other kids don't necessarily thrive in that. But for instance, if you come up with a project kind of or a problem statement, now go and explore, and let's go and explore this together. And you know what, you're not sitting all one on one in front of a screen. You're going to be 4 or 5 in front of the screens and do this together. Coming back to my social fabric
Yeah.
earlier, because one of the things that I think we have maybe focused on too much is that, we need to do this one-to-one. I think we need to do the technology much more socially than we may have been. Because that's also where these sparks of learning and sort of that co-creation and actually kids informing one another. You're struggling with this. Oh, why don't we try this? And sort of use it much more in the social context. I think would be a fantastic opportunity, and I would love to see that happen, and I would love to kind of go and see it happen as well. So and be part of that.
It would be fascinating to be that fly on the wall. Also, just from a business perspective as well, I find it amazing that we turn around to children and young learners and through their education and go, right, okay, cannot collaborate with anyone. You've got to work independently. You've got to sit the test
Yeah.
independently. And then we come into the
Yeah.
workplace and go, why are you not collaborating? Why are you not
Yes.
working with
Yeah.
your team? We were kind of like, surely
Yeah.
we're just, it just seems poles apart.
Yes, absolutely.
No,
And then the question, and then they resort to saying, I'll send you an email. rather than, really communicating and that collaboration. No, I've just sent you an email, because that's kind of the tool they know and that feels safe to kind of resort to. Yeah. Sorry,
That's
Greg,
such
I
a good.
interrupted.
No,
Yeah.
no, no, not a problem at all. It's such a good point. I often remark to my partner who's got kids that probably the most important thing that they're learning at the moment is team sports. If they're involved in team sport activity, that is probably heads and shoulders above anything that they'll ever learn in school, because they'll be able to collaborate and work with others. And that's really key, as Nigel pointed out, to getting on in the workspace, getting on in the work environment. Now, we've talked a lot about the ideal for what education should or could be.
Yeah.
If we get this right, what happens?
If we get this right, I think we've got a generation of youngsters who are much more prepared to face the world with perhaps more resilience, and also being able to kind of collaborate more, even in disciplines that aren't their own, because they can communicate with others, they can kind of make connections, and obviously they can use the tools, and they are probably more ready for the workplace. And I don't think we should just educate kids for the workplace. I'll be the last person to say that, and I feel that we potentially putting too much emphasis on that, because there's more to life than just the workplace. And if the rest of your life doesn't go very well, you're not going to do very well in the workplace either. So we need to kind of really look at this holistically in terms of well-being. I also think that if we do that well, we might equip them better with how they can tackle all the problems that we're throwing at them, and that they will have to solve. And something for which I feel also quite co-responsible, and haven't really got the answer on how we can avoid that from happening. But they are going to face enormous problems. They are going to also face fantastic opportunities, because every problem creates an amazing opportunity. But if you are not equipped to see that the problem also brings an opportunity, you're not going to solve it. If you don't see that actually I can't, this needs lots of people working together, I don't know how to do that, you're not going to solve. So those are the kind of things. And yes, I need the knowledge to be able to kind of tackle this problem. Absolutely. I need, or if I haven't got the knowledge, I need to know who has the knowledge to help me out. I can bring this bit, someone else can bring another bit to this problem, and we can actually try and work together to solve this. And that's also, I think, how we will embark on new scientific discovery, or new kind of technological discovery that way. If you look at, the kind of people who work at companies like DeepMind, they're not just developers. They're education researchers, they're psychologists. Look at how Apple started. That wasn't just techies. That was, people with behavioral psychology, cognitive psychology, user interface psychology. They had all these disciplines working together, which made Apple and the design of Apple what it is. And, so people kind of think, oh, they're all techies. No, they're not all techies. Yes, of course, a lot of them are. But you also have other disciplines that need to work together. I think it's the Francis Crick Institute rather. They actually have constructed architecturally the institute to such an extent that if you want a cup of coffee, you need to go through another department that does something different from yours. As far as I understand, that is kind of one of the key concepts of that institute. I may be wrong, and someone may ring you to say she's got this completely wrong, but that's what I've been told. And I think as a kind of institute that's focused on the endeavor of scientific discovery, that's exactly what needs to happen, because you're not just going to do it in your little silo. We need to pierce quite a lot of silos now, and I think that is really important, and that education needs to contribute to the ability to pierce the silo.
I love that. I do think we do need to pierce the silos. And just to pick up on your point, I can't comment on the Francis Crick Institute, but having worked for a number of large corporates around the world, um, I do know from an office design perspective that they are trying to create those moments of communication and
Yeah,
connection. And
yeah,
then we've gone away from those sort of those little almost cubicle type environments where people were just shut away, not shut away, but they were in their cubicle,
Yeah.
invisible, endeavoring away, to now being a lot more collaborative, different environments to try and encourage that, to use Greg's favorite word, serendipity, in terms of those conversations which
Yeah.
you may have with someone, which is purely coincidental, but actually then leads to an innovation in the workplace or the business that you're trying, whatever you're trying to do within the work environment. So yes, it's definitely important is to pierce those silos.
Yeah. Is that extrapolation of the magic of the coffee machine, isn't it? Where you all gather and start talking to one another and suddenly something happens. So if you extrapolate that to the whole layout of your workspace, then
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, some of the best conversations I've had and where we've sort of looked at real transformational type of change to our organization to look at how we um, generate revenue and drive business value has actually been over the lunch table in the canteen,
Yeah.
where you are just having a chat with the CFO versus, and then someone else is coming from technology, and all of a sudden, two of you going, well, and you go, oh, well, could we do this? So
Yeah.
definitely. And
Yeah.
education needs to nurture that as well.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
sorry, Greg, yeah, it looked like you were about to jump in, but I was talking away.
Oh, not at all. Carla, we talked earlier about the changing role of educators. Teachers, we're struggling in the UK. We won't go into the sort of full extent of the struggles that teachers are facing because they're coming from all angles. But you talked earlier about how they would become co-learners, how they would become mentors. How do you see, from a sort of short to medium term perspective, the role of teachers being able to utilize, I want to say utilize technology to help them to do their job better, but to adapt to this changing world in which kids need more support? Um, yeah, how do teachers need to change to be
I
able to for a changing future?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to just put the onus on the teacher, and we shouldn't just do that. It all starts with their teacher education and with their teacher development, professional development as they go along. Now, in some contexts, this is already happening and is going quite well. But for instance, if I look at teacher education, and it may have changed by now, but certainly when I was at the Institute of Education and also looking around the world at teacher education in a variety of countries, there was actually very, very little talk about the use of technology in the classroom. So in some countries, they might have spoken about it for an hour over the course of 2 years. It wasn't really kind of a kind of entity in that, or a subject or a domain in that was embedded in that teacher education. I think that's hopefully changing because that's also where it starts. So, just an example: you're just a newly qualified teacher. You haven't had that kind of exposure or that sort of look at how can we integrate technology soundly and pedagogically soundly in the classroom, and because you haven't been exposed to it, you suddenly arrive in a new school. You've got a classroom of 30 kids. Some of them may be a bit unruly. You're focusing all your attention on trying to manage that classroom. You're not going to be keen to kind of go, oh, I need to look at my screen to kind of work out what I need to do and what resource I need to call up. You're kind of so focused on managing that classroom. Now, I've got a big issue with a lot of LMSs because they're so difficult to use and they make teachers do exactly that, which kind of creates a disconnect between the teacher and their classroom for a start. So that's one thing. So, if you haven't been exposed to this, how can you do all that stuff at once, being a newly qualified teacher or still in teacher training, because depending on the route you take, you might be thrown in the classroom to do that. Uh, so that's one thing. And an interesting observation there, Craig, is that years ago I was involved in the development of a learning management system, and we rolled it out across a number of European markets. And the assumption was made that it was the young teachers who were going to be really key and very good at using this because they're used to technology and the older teachers aren't. What did we see? It was exactly the opposite, because the older teachers knew how to manage the classroom. They knew what they were going to teach. They had their lesson plans. They had it all sewn up to some extent, that they were able to kind of introduce that new beast called an LMS into their kind of practice with minimal training. So it's sort of, there's often this sort of misnomer in education that because kids play with technology all the time, they will be able to use all these systems in the classroom. Actually, they're not. It's kind of like, miss, I don't know how to use this, because it's so alien to what they used to in the kind of consumer side of the use of technology, which is much more frictionless than, some of these systems. And the same applies to teachers. I think Gen AI can make that a little bit easier, provided, all the good things I said. But that's, unless we start looking at the foundation of actually education and not the separation of there's technology and there's education and we need to bring the two together. No, technology needs to sit within it. The minute we start talking about it, we may have achieved it. If you get what I mean, because it becomes kind of sort of ubiquitous, but also so adopted that it's not really an issue anymore. It's still an issue, and that kind of creates that kind of gap between effective use or effective adoption, and that starts also with teacher education.
One follow-up question. Sorry, Nigel, I have one follow-up question just very quickly. I've worked in consumer tech for a long time, and the gamification of behavior within consumer tech is what makes it addictive. It's what creates behaviors. Maybe controversial, but how would you feel, or how do you feel about gamifying learning? Maybe even in the classroom to manage those unruly kids that otherwise might not want to engage in the topic or the subject or whatever it is.
That is a very interesting and again rather big question, because a lot of edtech companies are into gamification, big time, and that may have its place, but it shouldn't become the norm. And that's how quite often when you talk to startups, oh, we need to have gamification, we need to, because kids won't otherwise have the right level of attention. That's not the right way to go about it. They don't like friction. Well, you know what? Learning can be sometimes really, really hard, and that may suck, but actually that is part of that trajectory. And if we kind of gamify everything and, the kind of attention, seeking these short attention spans that gamification often brings, and that can be quite addictive, it actually takes away some of the deeper learning that you may need to do to kind of for things to stick. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It has its moments. I definitely wouldn't say you can't have gamification at all, but I also think you need to be very careful about where you use it and how you use it. Um, and it shouldn't become like, oh, okay, learning needs to be fun all the time. It'd be great if it could be, but it can't be. For good and deep learning, sometimes it has to be a little bit tricky. And if we also get kids to sort of, or prime kids that, all learning is fun and all learning is gamified and it's just a game, that is not going to be effective in how they grow into, sort of the adults that we need in society and that they need to be for themselves. So I think, I know there's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of interest by the technology companies in it. But we also, in this discussion, shouldn't forget the role of the parent. Because what we're starting to see, Greg, is actually a big backlash on the use of tech in schools, which is also potentially not very helpful because it's not going to equip the kids to be able to use tech well, ethically, with the right level of thought put into it. But there is a lot of backlash across Europe, across Australia's banned the phones, all these we are seeing a strong digital backlash. And that's in one way to be expected, because if your kid sits at a screen all the time at home, and then also sits at the screen all the time at school, that is really not healthy for the kid. And the parents don't like it because they feel that, it sort of enhances the addiction, if you like. So that is a nut that we now also have to crack in education. How do we kind of balance that? And what's the most effective use of that technology? And that will also, no doubt, require a bit of a rethink and getting parents on board that actually for their kids to use technology effectively, maybe using it thoughtfully in school can help them get there. But of course, that's not how the consumer tech works. And that's part of the problem, because it is kind of, let's keep them hooked, but also make them scroll. And that's where we have quite a lot of work to do. And to be honest, that is probably the hardest nut to crack now, because that around that nut hinges everything else, I think.
As, can I jump in and just give you the parents' view on the gamification question? So, because it was an interesting question you asked, Greg, and the reason why I was kind of sitting there going, it's something which has been permeating in the back of my mind for a while now. Is I look at my children and they're given by the teachers for maths and applications they're given, which gamify their maths and their learning. And what I notice is one is they're doing it because they want the reward from the game rather than actually for the love of learning. And therefore, is it actually right to be the learning is a byproduct rather than actual the main focus? And so therefore, are we teaching the children the wrong thing? So there's a question around that. It may, and also what it does is then is focusing on getting them again through that set door, that grading criteria that they have to attain a certain level in maths, rather than actually helping them deeply understand it. Because also the question moves on so quickly, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter if they get it right or wrong. It's just about attaining that 70% or getting the next icon or the free whatever comes, as part of that gamification. So I think there's partly that. And also what it does do is then I find is the kids will turn around, you'll say to them, right, you need to do your homework. And they go, I'll choose a gamification one. I'll choose the online a game to do their homework and go, look, I've done 40 minutes of this. But then they'll ignore the subjects, which they probably may take deeper thinking and
yeah,
more cognitive load to actually
yeah.
do. And then they don't focus on those. And I question whether through the gamification they're actually learning it or whether they're just learning to repeat it in that instant and whether it's going deep down into their brain and actually long-term memory. So I think it's fascinating. And also the other thing I think fascinating, Carla, about what you mentioned just now is there's different design philosophies around technology.
Yes.
And with some of those design philosophies around technology around, does technology act as a gilded cage whereby we kind of end up becoming directed by the technology, or does the technology sit in the background and enable us to be freer and actually have more time to make the decisions and explore the things we want? And I think within the classroom, what you're talking about in an educational setting there is sometimes technology comes in and starts dictating what you need to do rather than
Yeah.
actually being a time machine to take a load away from you, which you don't need to be doing, to actually give you more time to be an educator, to be a teacher. So are you responding to the system as a system responding to you and enabling you to be better at what you do as a human being?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail
Yeah.
on the head, Nigel. What's also often so overlooked is actually what's the pedagogical approach or the pedagogical setting in this, because, so often we see pedagogical approaches that may not be that suitable to kind of for the use of digital and not optimize how exactly to your point, how digital can do that. Because we haven't really thought about how do we frame it pedagogically in the classroom to exactly enable that. And of course, the minute gamification comes in, it sort of becomes its own, I wouldn't even say pedagogy, but it becomes its own little page because that's what it does. And there's often, I mean, some of the games are actually quite well thought through and psychologically incredibly well thought through. Pedagogically, some of them are more thought through than others. But it's very important that we also consider how we embed and actually make the pedagogy driver in these technologies to allow for to happen what you highlighted, Nigel, that not the cage but the enabler,
Yeah.
and that has to be kind of educational pedagogy pedagogically and learning led. And if it's technology led, that's where we will have problems.
I mean, just on that, what is an idea? We don't need to discuss it now, but just put it on the record. Maybe as an idea, we actually look for investors and we take education and EdTech out of the investment sphere and make it a not-for-profit investment sphere where people actually invest in. We almost set up investment funds dedicated to technology, which aren't looking to make a profit. Because as soon as you have to make a profit, it then dictates and you have to get a return on investment. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we should be losing money, but also maybe we actually have
No,
an
absolutely.
educational
Yeah.
system which is set up, which is there to get the best out of technology rather than necessarily getting a return on investment by a given time frame. So we reshape what that investment criteria is. And maybe that's something we need to look at with EdTech.
I would really welcome that because I think we would see a lot of improvement. We would see better impact for sure. Because now, if you're driven by VC investment, you're driven by the needs of that investment, not necessarily by the impact you're making. I know there's impact investment, but ultimately a lot of the impact investment is still very focused on that return on investment for a variety of valid reasons. Absolutely. I'm not sort of saying, but I agree with you. We should have that kind of space where we have that opportunity to not do it for profit, but actually to kind of embed it in the system, or in at grassroots level as well. We shouldn't always ignore the grassroots opportunity here, because it's from the grassroots. You see that often in Africa, where the grassroots are actually innovating so well and leapfrogging and doing amazing things. Like, for instance, bringing learning on mobile phones to Maasai communities in Kenya that are, nomadic. We wouldn't think of anything like that because we don't need that, but they do. And they come up with amazing solutions within very restrictive context, if you like, technology-wise, but they do all this stuff. And that, for me, is very exciting. And that is not necessarily immediately profit-focused or ROI-focused, because they often get kind of support from MasterCard or other organizations to do exactly this. Not saying it should be MasterCard supporting everyone, right? But there has to be, I agree with you, we have to be cleverer about how we kind of invest.
Are you saying there's other payment providers apart from MasterCard?
It shouldn't necessarily be all
Yeah,
the kind of
yeah.
corporate social responsibility that does this either, because that may not end up being very sustainable. So we need to find sustainable routes for that kind of investment.
But it's amazing, isn't it, human ingenuity when we're given the opportunity to be, remove those constraints and guardrails, that you do find solutions like that, sort of, finding how do you provide education to nomadic uh, people. So, I mean, you've kind of alluded to it already, but one of the things I wanted to ask about is, we've talked about teachers. We've talked about making sure that learners are put back at the center of education, and actually remembering that that's what education is for, is about the learners. Who else do you think needs to be involved in those if we want to make a ground shift and change, who else needs to be involved in those conversations?
Oh, that is a very good question. I think the conversation needs to be very interdisciplinary, and obviously policy needs to be involved. Because now we definitely have, policy often referring to academia and research, absolutely needed. But that's a conversation that then happens kind of in isolation in the policy world, not necessarily very connected to the kind of end recipients, whether they're teachers, school leaders, or the kids, or their parents of that system. So there's a kind of disconnect between the two. So I think to make that conversation more meaningful, we definitely need the policy people closely involved. We need obviously the educators involved, the school, the leadership, the thought leadership, academia for sure, but not always just from what their researchers told them, but also kind of thinking outside the box. I'm hearing this, so how do I maybe need to look at my research to kind of integrate what I'm hearing? Rather than the research has told me this, and therefore we're going to have to do that. Because let's not forget that research questions are obviously often extremely narrow, which they have to be by the nature of the research. So it's how do we kind of widen that conversation, and how do we bring these kind of different bits of the silo, because education is very siloed. How do we pierce the silos again to bring that kind of dare I say the word stakeholders? It's a hot, but round the table to kind of engage in that interdisciplinary conversation
So
or dialogue.
if it's a policy first approach, Carla, and let's say we put you in front of a bunch of ministers tomorrow, what kind of 3 changes would you begin with to help create and design the education system that you think would be future proofed?
I would definitely kind of say we need to change the exam system. We need to change the assessment system. That's first and foremost. That should not be the driver of the education system. And okay, we might need to kind of have some way of measuring how youngsters are doing. They'll want to know themselves, how am I faring? How am I doing? What am I doing? Am I doing this right? So I'm not saying eradicate all the kind of types of assessment altogether, but we definitely need to rethink how we look at exams, what the exams are for. Why are we doing them? What are they for? And how can we rethink them to also accommodate, the sort of skills, like how do kids do in social interaction? How do they do, doing project work? How do they work together? How do they problem solve? How do they, and also focus much more on the process of learning rather than just the answer to a question that is like, oh, I've learned this, I've got this bit of knowledge, I know how to solve this maths equation. But in the meantime, there's nothing about the process of learning. So if we can kind of frame assessment more around how they come to give us an answer or ask a question, what is the process they use? That I think would be much more meaningful. Then also take that whole pressure out of, we need to do your GCSEs and you need to have X, Y, and Z grade to be able to go to university. Not every kid wants or should go to university. That is, that's also still very much the driver of, the kind of aspirational pathway that we still kind of get kids to aspire to. There are other things. So it shouldn't be like, school should not be the conduit to university. School should be the conduit to lots of things. That's something I would say to policymakers. And then to the technology side of things, because that's obviously something I work in quite a lot, is, how do we embed this meaningfully? Give room for experimentation, embed it in teacher education. Don't see it as an efficiency tool, to lighten teachers' workload, because I don't think that's going to happen. But see it as a sort of enabling and an augmentation tool that makes teaching and learning better. And for instance, also address that there are different demographical needs in society that need to be able to kind of make use of these tools according to their needs. Like one of the things the DFE is doing, and one way I applaud them for it, but I think we may see the kind of flip side of how AI is being used, is, kind of helping using AI tutors for schools in resource poor contexts in the UK to help kids pass their exams mainly, and using AI tutors to do that. And it's exactly those kind of settings that may need that relational side of education, possibly even more. And, by just replacing it with an AI tutor, you might kind of decrease that relational need that is really needed in those contexts. So it's not black and white, this thing. It's very, millions and millions of colors. And of course, that makes it quite difficult. But there are certain things that I think we can definitely do that also would address the lack of interest by a lot of kids. I mean, the kids being absent from school is like, especially endemic. So we need to kind of look at why are they absent? There's something wrong. We're not doing it right. And if we keep investing in a system that perpetuates not doing it right and keeping kids absent, what's the point? I'm not that kind of surpasses my little brain. So so, um, so that's those are kind of things that I would probably raise with them.
I was going to say, you definitely want to have that conversation. I get the feeling that you're the energy and the passion there. You're keen to have that conversation. Um,
They might not
um,
be so keen to hear it.
well, maybe everyone needs to sit down and listen sometimes, don't they?
There are quite a
Yeah,
few people who listen to that conversation
yeah.
in the policy sphere, so I shouldn't really sort of get the big brush out at all, because there are definitely loads of people who have the same passion, who want to see improvement. So and it's hopefully those people can also kind of make that happen in
I think
collaboration with everybody else. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I agree with you. I think we sometimes we use too much stick and not enough carrot in terms of motivating people and giving them those sorts of incentives to. And part of that is making education a place they want to be part of. Making it, and then we need to understand the human behind it, the learner. Because if we understand them, then we can actually motivate them to do get education up, so they are actually motivated to be part of it. And then we
Yes,
get
exactly.
productive members of society. Um, which I suppose leads on to my probably last question. Really, is we've talked about the educate who needs to be in the room. We've talked about the policymakers. Parents are a key part of this. What is
Yes.
the role of the parents in this without them becoming a teacher or an educator? What can they do to help be part of this future?
Mm, I think we probably also don't need to just put that onto the parent.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be, and some schools do this amazingly well, where parents are kind of really sort of connected to the school, involved in what the school does, and that is one thing that I think we can definitely look at. The other thing is like parents have got a pretty tough task because, often they're both working, or one of them, if you're a single parent, you might be doing three jobs. So you don't necessarily have all the time that you want and need to spend with your child. And therefore, hey, here's an iPad or a tablet is, like the TV used to be a good thing.
Mm.
This is, helps me get through the day. Um, and you can't really blame the parents necessarily for doing that. But of course, it's kind of perpetuating the problem. And then if you look at, how, for instance, a lot of youth are sort of left to their own devices, because we haven't got the youth centers anymore. We haven't got those social hubs anymore where, the teens can go mingle together. Also, engage then in discussion with their parents on what they've done, or parents not just saying how was your school day, but parents also saying, hey, I heard about this today, what do you think? And sort of bring that kind of level of conversation into it. But I think it's a really hard question, this, Nigel, because there are so many different flavors of being a parent because of different needs of being a
Yeah.
parent. But I also think that if we can kind of connect school more to the parents, that maybe also, because we're asking a lot of schools as well. I kind of sit sometimes in meetings where I think like, when do you get time to teach? Because you're dealing with all these kind of out of school issues, and it's kind of, how do we bridge that gap? I haven't got an answer for that. I just know we need to do something, and that will absolutely rely on that kind of joint effort of different people coming together to kind of um, solve that problem. But that's a big one, and I quite often get asked, at what time should we get kids to interact with technology, and or should we take it away from them? And then I often answer that question, well, is that really the question? If a young mother who's feeding her baby feeds the baby while she's constantly looking at the mobile phone, one of the key essentials for that baby is to connect to the mother's eyes. And because that's where it reads emotion, that's where it kind of reads, mum creates that a relationship with mother. But if mother is looking at her mobile phone while she's feeding the baby, you've got that. That's lost. And that's already where it starts, because it's already from that infancy stage that actually the screen is starting to take over. So I think, it's very hard to say, oh, well, the kids shouldn't be on screen so much and we're going to rebel against it as parents. But we also need to look as being a parent, how do we use the screen? And what's the example we set for the kids? And I know this is all very idealistic and maybe a bit naive on my part, but I do think there's something in that.
It is tough, and I get it as two working parents, that how much you're drawn in different directions,
Yeah,
and all of the needs that you have, and also the constant demands for your attention, be it from work, be it no work has evolved from being a 9 to 5. You leave, no one can contact you, go home, and then you're doing your home job and so forth. Now work can be 24/7. You can be crossing different,
absolutely. Yeah,
you can be
yeah.
working multiple time zones. And then you've also got to deliver for your family and for your loved ones and those around you. So I get, for the parents, it is an exceptionally tricky um, path to navigate. And I think one of my favorite expressions is I know you alluded to this just now, is about being a team effort. And it's about cooperation and collaboration between community, parents, children, the educational system, all of those coming together. Because I think, I'm not quite sure of the origin of this phrase, but it takes it takes a village to raise a child.
With the child, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
which I think is a beautiful way of describing actually what is needed to raise these wonderful human beings.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a tough nut to crack for sure.
It is.
And it's not a single nut either. So yeah. Mm-mm.
No.
So, Carla, thank you for joining us. And
Thank
everyone, if you've
you.
liked what you've heard, please like and share and subscribe for more. Visit Behind the Algorithm for all of our episodes. And a quick thanks to our production team, Laura Marquis de Silva, Jonathan Demelkin, CC Fan, and Ola Ush. And Carla, would you like to lead us out with anything? Final thoughts?
Oh my goodness. That's so much already. I
There's
think
going to be some great sound bites in there.
um, opportunities there for the taking. We have a lot of issues to solve, but those issues also create opportunities. And it's only together that we can grasp them and solve them. So that's my takeaway, I think.
I love it. Carla, thank you so much.